From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Since the Supreme Court ruling last week on what constitutes a woman, the government has welcomed the decision. Repeatedly.
This ruling brings welcome clarity and confidence for women and service providers.
I welcome the court's decision. I think it's very important that we've now got real clarity.
We welcome as a government the clarity that the Supreme Court have delivered. That is an important clarification.
That does provide that clarity.
While clarity has become the most overused word in Westminster this week, there's been remarkably little of it in making sense of how the ruling will affect real life and what it means for trans women.
If a trans woman used a female changing room yesterday, which changing room should they use today?
I think we need to make sure that in this discussion we are following both the law, so that is clear for service providers, and this varies upon what the provision of those service providers are. Large organisations, smaller organisations, many smaller organisations.
Sorry, why does it vary?
Well, because some
if it's
will
the
have
law?
Unisex provisions. It's a large, complex issue.
Yeah,
take
but we're
time
looking for clarity
to
from
study it.
you as the government.
The ruling has left many in the trans community dismayed and led to protests over the weekend. So what does the ruling mean, practically? Last week, we heard from one of the campaigners on how the Supreme Court ruling had come about. Today, we hear from a trans campaigner on what it means for them. The story today: the fallout from the Supreme Court ruling.
My name is Helen Belcher. I'm the managing director of an organisation called TransActual. We set up a few years back to try and advocate for improvements to make trans people's lives better, but also to help trans people advocate for themselves better.
And Helen, take us back to last week when the ruling came in from the Supreme Court. What did you make of it? How did you feel?
Well, I felt numb and stunned. It became very worrying because I know that trans people, very eminent trans lawyers, had asked to give evidence to the court and the court had said no. But it allowed evidence from groups who are campaigning against trans people's inclusion in society. And then the judgment just started repeating all of that stuff. It felt like a real miscarriage of justice at the beginning. And it also felt very cruel because, I transitioned, more than 20 years ago. It was a painful time in my life. You do a very long and mentally difficult period of introspection, trying to examine yourself. And then I went on to have some surgeries and I lost my job and I lost a number of important relationships to me. And it was like the court was then saying, yes, I know you've been living as a woman and treated as a woman for over 20 years, but you're not a woman really, are you? And that is an incredibly cruel thing to do.
I can imagine how difficult that must have felt. We've had a few days now, and obviously sort of people are trying to make sense of the ruling and what it means and how it'll translate into real life. What does that ruling actually mean? How much will your life change? Is that clear yet?
No, it's not clear. There's a lot of fear. As we're recording, the Prime Minister apparently has said that trans women should use men's facilities. the judgment itself, they tried to say it has very limited effect. But I don't think it can. I think it has potentially massive implications. The Supreme Court can't use statements like trans women are biological men for those statements not to be used in other cases around the country to try and show that trans women should not have the rights that other women have. So the implication of that, who knows? And if we go to the use of single-sex spaces, which has sort of blown up since the Easter weekend, what is the government actually saying that I should do? Should I be forced to go into the men's toilets? That's actually quite dangerous for me. And so there's an impact on my safety. There's an impact on my privacy. So those are two basic human rights, which the government is saying, no, I don't have a right to privacy, even though it's in the Human Rights Act. It's not brought clarity at all. The ruling also talks about, I've used the terms they're biological men or biological women, but there's no definition of what that means.
What does it mean to you?
It doesn't mean anything to me other than it's a term of abuse. Anti-trans groups started using it 3 to 4 years ago to try and say, yeah, but you're a biological male. And so that term of abuse has now become enshrined in a Supreme Court judgment. I don't quite know how to put that into words, how that makes me feel.
I imagine there are probably some people who would talk about biological sex without wanting it to be a term of abuse. For example, it matters, I suppose, in policy terms. So, we talk about inequalities in healthcare, in women's health. Obviously, if you're born a woman, you will probably have slightly different issues to a trans woman. Are there cases where actually that classification is quite useful?
Well, yes, there are, but it's not in that demeaning term. There was this big discussion about whether cisgender was a term of abuse or not, and these anti-trans people said, yes, it was, and then continued to refer to trans people in the most abusive terms possible. So yes, there does need to be a way of distinguishing certain issues, but there is never any very clear defining line. Medicine will always have some things that medics might need to know in some situations, but the person on the street bumping into me going about my daily business, why does it matter to them?
But if the law was able to protect rights of trans women and not classify them as men, but classify them as trans women, would that be acceptable?
No, because our society, like it or not, is gendered. And this is what Baroness Faulkner tried to do, is that trans people should lobby for third spaces. Well, that's a segregationist argument, that we're neither one thing nor the other. And if you look back at the court rulings from even the 1980s, 1990s, it was realised that creating this limbo space for trans people was a really bad solution, because then you're not one thing or the other. And that the only real way of treating people with respect is to respect their decisions. What the government has said is, I don't care what you've done, I don't care what you feel. We know who you are, you don't.
The judges who made the ruling said that they didn't want it to be seen as a victory for either side, and that trans women would still be protected under the Equalities Act. Is that reassuring?
No. Again, I don't see how you can say I'm only now protected under the Equalities Act as a man when in all of my interactions I'm a woman. That removes my protection. It gives me no confidence in that.
Is there anything that could be done to tweak the law that would make that better? You talked earlier about the fact that you've gone through this process for 20 years to be able to live as a woman, and that doesn't seem to be recognised by the law. after that Supreme Court ruling. I mean, if they were to recognise the status of a trans woman, somebody who's been through all of that, and award them rights accordingly, I mean, is that what you need? Is that what's left now? Is that the missing part?
That's kind of what we had, wasn't it? Up until Wednesday, I had those rights as a woman. I was accorded those dignity, and that's been stripped away from me. We're still trying to work out what it means. I think it's really hard on top of that to say, well, how should this be corrected when, I mean, I've been speaking to very eminent lawyers over the last few days, and they don't have a clue either. And in fact, the remedy most often cited to me is we need to get a case before the European Court in Strasbourg because we are no longer compliant with the Convention on Human Rights. We are in the same position that the UK fell foul of in 2002, which led to the Gender Recognition Act in the first place. I don't know on this trajectory what the answer is. We should go back to the other one, as far as I can see.
And Helen, when we've heard from people who were part of the campaign that led to the Supreme Court ruling, they always argue that they felt this was a victory for single-sex spaces because they felt unsafe in them before, particularly after the Gender Recognition Act meant that it became so much easier to declare yourself a woman. I mean, for somebody like you who's been through the process of transitioning, who's lived as a woman for 20 years, was any of that uncomfortable? Did it feel uncomfortable that a man could turn around tomorrow and declare that he felt like a woman and have the same rights as you?
It misrepresents what the process actually is.
Just tell us a bit about that, because I imagine a lot of people listening won't have gone through it.
There's two aspects, and I guess what they were complaining about was the right to self-determination, which was in the Equality Act.
Which could be used for the wrong reasons. I suppose that there was just the fear of it being used by bad actors.
And the evidence for that was what? Because that provision was originally introduced into the Sex Discrimination Act in 1999. So in the intervening 26 years, how many cases have there been? Remarkably few. How many cases of assault have there been by men who've just walked into the women's loos anyway? If they wanted to disguise themselves, I bet they disguised themselves as plumbers or cleaners. But I suspect actually most of them didn't disguise themselves at all. Trans women are far more likely to be the victims of violence in women's spaces than other women. That's already the case. Trans women are extremely unlikely to be the perpetrators of violence. The evidence just isn't there to support that.
I suppose it's been talked about so much, but high-profile cases like Isla Bryson was convicted of raping 2 women and then, while awaiting trial, decided to change gender and therefore be imprisoned with women. I mean, things like that, I suppose, will have raised a lot of questions about whether the law was protecting the rights of women, which is where a lot of this has come from. I mean, do you have empathy with that? Sort of fear, I suppose.
On that particular issue, though, that's one case. One case. And I don't want violent men in women's spaces either.
Yeah.
Right? I very much suspect that the prison service didn't follow its own rules in that case. So we are looking at an exceptional case being used to strip rights from everybody else. As a counsellor, I make decisions on, or make recommendations certainly, about speed limits. If I was to use that exceptionalisation, I would turn around and say, well, there's been an accident on that road, we should probably close it. We wouldn't get very far if we were to use that exceptionalisation. Yes, okay, there will be an individual who's committed horrific crimes. There are women who've also committed horrific crimes. Some against other women, some against children. Do we therefore use those as examples to say we shouldn't allow women access to children? That's what's happened here.
But this is an example of people using a bit of legislation that was supposed to offer rights to people who needed them, but using it for the wrong reasons, misusing it in order to carry out potentially more attacks, but certainly sort of allowing them in spaces where people would be vulnerable. People will have seen that.
Hold on, Manveen, that is one person where the rules were very probably not followed. So why should we be punished for the misuse of the rules or misinterpretation of the rules by one official body? The point is, irrespective of that, we have rights of privacy, dignity, and safety ourselves. Our society breaks people down into men and women. There aren't these third spaces. Public authorities, I know I'm a councillor, we have no money. We do not have the ability to build third spaces, which actually wouldn't be any safer for trans people either. So you will always get exceptions. Surprise, surprise, criminals do criminal things. Most of us are not criminals. But what is being done here is a criminal who's done criminal things is going to strip the rights, be used as an excuse to strip the rights from hundreds of thousands of people. And it's worse than that, because if you start thinking about access to these spaces, how are you actually going to police it, in effect? Are you going to put some member of staff on every single entrance to women's toilets? Are they going to demand paperwork? Are they just going to pull over those they suspect might be trans? What happens to all of those women who aren't trans? You had the British Transport Police on Thursday say, trans women, when a strip search is necessary, will now be strip searched by male officers. There is no duty on a trans person to say to a police officer, I am trans. So how are the police going to determine this? And as my female friends started realising this on Thursday, how do they prove they are not trans to the police? Most of them started to get really angry, because this is not protecting women at all. This is policing women. You will be judged on how you appear, how you sound, how you look. Are you woman enough to get into these spaces? That's what it means. It's not a victory for women at all. It is gender visibly non-conforming women who bear the brunt of this. It's not trans people.
The government hasn't sort of been very good at clarifying where the law stands on any of this. What do you think they should be doing? What would help? What do you want to hear from the government now?
It would be nice if they actually started talking and listening to trans people. And we need to hear that they are committed to protecting the safety and the dignity of the ability of trans people to go about their daily lives uninhibited in the way that we were before, in the same way that everybody else is allowed to go around their daily lives.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us.
I'm Aubrey Allegretti, the Times' chief political correspondent.
Aubrey, I feel like I've heard the word clarity a lot in the last few days, but actually there hasn't been that much. Ministers have been caught off guard. They seem to be still tripped up by the subject when they're asked which loos a trans woman should be using. Are they all waiting for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to tell them what to think about it? Will they interpret the law?
So the law has been interpreted, if you like, by the Supreme Court. They have, in effect, given greater definition to some of the terms in the Equality Act of 2010. And campaigners who'd been pushing for the right to self-identification were saying that sex and gender were, if you like, interchangeable terms, and that people could, be able to identify as a woman if they'd been born biologically male. And so the government looked to the watchdog responsible to sort of implement those recommendations and come up with advice. But I think that is one of the key criticisms that Keir Starmer and other Labour ministers have faced is, why did you need a court to tell you the law? And indeed, if you listen to people like Kemi Badenoch, why did you need a court to tell you things that should be common sense?
The Prime Minister said it is not right to say only women have a cervix. In 2022, he said it is the law that trans women are women. In 2023, he said, and I quote, 99% of women don't have a penis. I know what a woman is, and I always have. Yeah. The people of this country know what a woman is. We didn't need the Supreme Court to tell us that.
And tell us about Keir Starmer's position on this, because it feels like he's been on a bit of a journey.
Well, Keir Starmer, really came to prominence for most people back in 2020 when he ran initially for the Labour leadership. He was looking to succeed Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour Party membership was largely viewed as being quite sympathetic to Corbyn on a sort of policy agenda, being quite left-wing. And so Keir Starmer laid out 10 leadership pledges, most of which he ended up sort of abandoning at some point over the course of his 4 years in opposition in preparation for government. But he did things like sign LGBT Labour's pledge that people should be allowed to self-identify with a gender different to the one that they were assigned at birth. And indeed, it was a rocky few years for the Labour Party. Ministers found themselves sometimes in very difficult positions when they were asked to define what is a woman. Some people were more willing to kind of lean into the gender-critical arguments than others, and other ministers were sort of suggesting that trans people were being treated as victims, and the conversation was too reductionist on a sort of biological level, talking about who had penises and who had cervixes. And so over the course of those sort of 2 or 3 years, Keir Starmer came under a lot of difficulty. He managed to lose a Labour MP, Rosie Duffield, and he said that it was wrong to say that only women had a cervix.
That was after she said only a woman could have a cervix.
Exactly, and she was sort of chastised, and eventually Rosie Duffield ended up leaving the Labour Party. And yet Keir Starmer continued to maintain that women were both people who were born biologically female, but also people who self-identified as a woman. And as the general election drew closer, and it was increasingly sort of weaponised against the Labour Party by the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak, I remember, memorably standing up at one point and saying, we know what a woman is, we're going to protect our women. And so it was part of the sort of debate that was being used by the Conservatives to try and frame the general election campaign. And it was at that point that Keir Starmer stopped being quite so forthright in his sort of strident view that women should be allowed to self-identify. And now we have the result where actually on Tuesday, when Downing Street's spokesperson was asked, does Keir Starmer still believe that a trans woman is a woman? They said emphatically no.
Aubrey, for Labour, it's a difficult policy subject, because on the one hand, you've got the Rosie Duffields who had to leave the party because she was very much in line with the Supreme Court ruling. On the other hand, you have a lot of people who have campaigned for trans rights for years now, and there's already a sense that there is anger within the ranks over this decision. Tell us how that's playing out.
Absolutely. The Labour Party is quite deeply divided on this because you have a very sort of strong wing of MPs who feel very socially motivated. They want to sort of represent who they see as the sort of minorities of society, the people whose rights they see are often quashed. And so I think there is a real attempt to sort of try not to use this as a way to make trans people feel scared or that there isn't a place for them in society anymore. It's about trying to tell them that, they might have to adapt their sort of behaviours and work in different ways, even if they've been sort of presenting in a different body for the last few decades.
Well, Aubrey, there was this statement in Parliament on Tuesday. It allowed MPs to have their say on the subject. You were watching every minute.
Yeah, it was a really testy debate, and the tone for that was set very much from the start because Bridget Phillips, the Education Secretary, was straight out of the traps criticising Kemi Badenoch, who had been her predecessor under the Conservatives as Equality Secretary, effectively saying that Kemi Badenoch had done nothing for women, that the Equality Act had existed since 2010, and the Conservatives had made no attempts to change the law in that space since. And Kemi Badenoch came straight back. She accused the government of having peddled a shameless work of fiction, effectively revising their view on this subject. That was the sort of spiky tone that continued to underpin the debate with barbs, certainly between the Labour and Conservative benches, but also a real great sense of shame, I think, emanating from some Labour MPs as well, who really sort of raised their deep concerns. Nadia Whittome, who was the MP for Nottingham East, she criticised trans people's exclusion from toilets they have long used and said there was nothing in law prohibiting people effectively who are trans continuing to go about their day-to-day lives as is. Dawn Butler, the MP for Brent East.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if anyone else in the House has butch lesbian friends and have been with them when they've been told to get out of women's toilets, but I have. And it is not pleasant, and it's not. So those people that are using this as a political football, again, should be ashamed of themselves.
She was talking about the fact that this might have unintended consequences, i.e. somebody who is a lesbian and born female, but presents in a slightly more masculine way. Would people now feel emboldened to go out of their way to challenge this woman in a toilet and ask why they were there? You also had the kind of gender-critical wing and sort of female sex-based rights wing of the Labour Party out in force as well.
Since I've been in this House, I have felt the force of the lobby, which has made people and MPs across this House stand there and say that trans women are women.
You had Tonia Antonazzi, the Labour MP for Gower, who also criticised the damage done by charities supporting gender-questioning children.
What steps is she going to take to make sure that they rectify the damage they've done to a generation of trans and gender-questioning children?
So the government is not just being pressured from one side of the Labour Party, and indeed it will find that the ball now falls into the Equality and Human Rights Commission's court. I suppose putting pressure on that watchdog to draw up this advice as quickly as possible to provide not just the legal clarity now, but the practical clarity about how this should operate in prisons, in hospitals, in other walks of life. And indeed, Baroness Faulkner, who is the chair of the EHRC, her term is set to come to an end later this year. So I suspect that there will be lots of people paying attention to who the government nominates to take up her post afterwards.
And where they stand on trans rights.
Absolutely, because this is somebody who's potentially going to be incredibly influential in this stream of work and others, and they head a watchdog which will be responsible effectively for policing and looking at this guidance and how it's being implemented. I think you hear from so many Labour MPs, they say this didn't bring much clarity, actually. It brought a lot of confusion. And, the legal ruling is one thing, but now the practical application is another. And in the meantime, in the months ahead, you have people that don't know how to adopt or adapt their behaviour, including, as I mentioned, people who biologically were born one way, but, might present a different way or don't have the right chromosomes or don't have a cervix or a womb, or have been presenting as trans for decades. They're going to find that their whole sort of lives might be quite upended by this decision. And at the end of the day, it all rests on human behaviour and how people react. Will they be challenged when they go to the toilet or when they go into changing rooms? That will just be borne out in the day-to-day lives of these people.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times, and we also heard from Helen Belcher from TransActual. You can find all the latest on the fallout from the Supreme Court's ruling at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Shabnam Grewal and Rosie Stopher. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.